Dr. Butterfield. Next, we have James Hankins, Renaissance historian and professor at Harvard University.
So I was thinking when you were saying about the motto of Harvard is Veritas. A couple of years I thought they should change the name to the motto of the town of Arpido, which produced Marius and Cicero. And the motto of Arpido is Hinc ad Imperius, from here to empire. But what I want to talk about in my brief time is not the entire sweep of history, but one man who used his free will to change things and was at the right moment, which we are also at the right moment to do so. So in my lecture the other night, some of you were there, I know, I talked about this passage in the Paradiso, where it's right in the center of the Divine Comedy. It's Canto 16 of the Purgatorio, right halfway. Now mezzo di comitia of the Divine Comedy, and they're in a murk that no one knows how to get out. There is stinging smoke, and it's miserable. They're surrounded by the prideful. So Dante asked Virgil, his guide, what's wrong with this world? What's wrong with this world? It's falling apart. And the empire and the papacy are at each other's throats. And there's an explanation of that, which I talk about in the lecture. But right before they talk about what's wrong with the political side of the world, Virgil says to Petrarch, let me back up. Petrarch says to Virgil, he says, it's probably the stars, right? It's fate. It's, we can't do anything about it. It's the stars, the astrology is equivalent of forces and factors in history today. And forces that we can't control are controlling our lives. And Virgil comes back and says, we have free will. You can change this, right?
Yeah, right.
So Dante does change things, but so does Petrarch. I want to talk about Petrarch, because Petrarch is somebody who really changed things. He was a man, in my history of Renaissance political thought, I identify him as the real Fons and Argo of the Italian Renaissance. There were people interested in the classics all through the Middle Ages. There were lots of Italians, especially in the time of Dante. In fact, there were scholars who were trying to get Dante to write the Divine Comedy in Latin. Dante very wisely said no. But Petrarch is the one who turns all of these impulses in his time into a movement. And he lived at a terrible time. I once had a professor in college who said to me, the 14th century is a bad century. And I'm sitting there, a Cal undergraduate, and I say, how can a century be bad? Come on. But the 14th century, I will tell you, is a bad century. And it starts at as we now say, the long 14th century. It starts in 1291 with the fall of the last Crusader kingdom in the Holy Land. So if, in effect, the period after the Crusades have failed. And then all the soldiers have come back.
Bad?
And they have no high enterprise to follow. So what they do is they turn themselves into gangsters, and they start armies, and they start marching all over France and all over Italy. They come to Italy in the summertime, of course. And they maraud, and they shake down the cities. And then there's a famine. A huge famine, the worst famine in the Middle Ages, in the 1330s. And then in 1342, there's a breakdown of the financial system. The first big banking crisis, when Europe just goes bankrupt. No one can get a loan for the next 20 years. And then, of course, there's the Black Death, which is not COVID. Now, the Black Death wipes out 40% of the population. Okay, it's not 1/15 of 1%. It's 40%. Their bodies in the streets. Okay. So Petrarch is living through all this, and he starts out his life as his father wanted him to be a lawyer, That's why he sent him to Bologna. But when he got to Bologna, he discovered that he'd get much more interest from the ladies and the other young people there if he wrote poetry. So he became a great Italian poet and famous all over Italy, all over Europe. And he had his lady love, Laura, who was his inspiration to high divine, holy poetry. But then the Black Death hits, and one of his friends died. His patron dies. The patron is controlling, who's offering, gives him the job. So what do? They're absolutely stunned by this. He gets together with his friends. He has a few friends who have survived. They decide they're going to go to some place in the hills, and they're going to copy manuscripts. This is before printing, right? So they're thinking, God is really punishing us. There's something desperately wrong with our world. And the only thing we can do is to copy manuscripts so that some future age will be able to revive our culture. And then he gets involved with Cola di Rienzo. You might know the Wagner opera of Rienzi, right? So Cola di Rienzo is a revolutionary, and he is also a reader of Livy and wants to bring back the Roman Empire. And Petrarch loves this at first, and he becomes the publicity manager for Cola di Rienzo's Roman Revolution. But it all falls apart very quickly, and Petrarch realizes that political revolution is not the answer. Political revolution, he understood what happened to Cola di Rienzo. He's the human extreme. He's a meritocratic figure whose mother was a laundry woman, his father was an innkeeper. Cola di Rienzo, by the way, means next son of Larry in Roman dialect. Okay, so he's not an exalted figure, but he has an exalted idea, and he's trying to bring back the Roman Empire, but the crooked timber of humanity won't allow that. So Petrarch realizes that kind of force majeure, that kind of political movement is not going to work. That the real problem, as he says, the real problem is human nature. It's the lack of goodness in human nature. And he's looking around him, and he's surrounded by armies and warlords and people. He looks at the universities, and in his view, not the view of many modern people, but in the view of Petrarch, the universities are a total disaster. In Italy, the universities are mostly teaching law, a little bit of medicine. So Petrarch decides that he has to change human nature. So he gets a program together, which he calls the Humanities, the Studia Humanitatis, which are going to transform human nature through poetry, history, moral philosophy, oratory, eloquence, poetry, history, moral philosophy, which are not covered in the seven liberal arts, you'll notice. Rhetoric is, but it's different from oratory. And the idea is that these new studies are going to change the human heart and make it possible to have a Renaissance. So he goes throughout the rest of his life. He's not really sure whether he's going to succeed. He has some like-minded people. He has an enormous correspondence, and he has the Familiares letter and then the letters of old age. He knows everybody in Europe. Everybody from the emperor and the pope down to the local schoolmaster. And he's a very charming man. He's tall, he's handsome, he has apparently a fascinating voice. He talks Latin. And he's trying to talk people into the idea of making better human beings, improving the quality of humanity through the study of the humanities. And the way you do that is you get in touch with antiquity. You return to antiquity. You seek the ancient mother, as Virgil says. And so he develops an educational program called the Humanities, which is going to supplement the existing seven liberal arts, and which will operate outside the universities. And he trains a few people, his close disciples, but mainly he's not a school teacher himself. He likes to live with princes and get them on side with his project. He lived with several princes in the course of his later life. But the project, when he went to his grave in 1474, thinking he had failed, because there was one prince who took him up on his project to renew the humanities. But what Petrarch wasn't aware of was he had hundreds and thousands of admirers who read his works. And he decided that, and what happened was after he died, that those seeds that he dropped in the ground, they grew. And they created the humanist movement, which was a revolution in humanistic education, which is what we have to do, is to have a renaissance of our own. And it's in the Western tradition. We do renaissances in the Western tradition. It's been done by the Church Fathers, was done in the 12th century, it was done in the 14th, 15th century. We can do it today. All right.
Thank you, Professor Hankins. Next, Dr. Joseph Conlon. He is the director of Ralston's famous Greek program and professor of Greek here at Ralston College.
It is truly a pleasure to be here today, and I hardly dare to add to everything that has been said already, but I will try as best as I can. And I'd like to talk particularly about why I believe that language pedagogy is the foundation for Renaissance and for cultural renewal. Now, this might seem, depending on your perspective, something that is ridiculous or something that is very obvious. And I'd like to start by just making a few comments about what language is and what it does, how it functions. And I think that these are all pretty obvious, but I would like to outline them and then talk about why, in particular, we teach Greek the way that we do and why we have Greek and Latin as the foundation for our curriculum here at Ralston. So one of the things that language
should
does,
have Hebrew.
and maybe this is a funny way of putting it, but that it connects us automatically to the generation that has come before us. And what I mean is all of the words that I'm using here today, all of the words that we know in our head, were all first uttered by people who are long dead. And as we grow up, the language of our parents is, and the world around us is imprinted on our brains. We're literally being stamped with the words of the past. In the next generation, we then do that for those who come after us. And maybe this seems like sort of as I said, an obvious remark to make, but that is the function of language on the scale of a century or so, maybe 2 centuries or 3 centuries. It's to take culture and move it from one generation to another generation, from the lowest level, the level of the word, the lexeme, the verb, to the higher level, the level of the story, the song. And these are just being transmitted from generation to generation. Now, the function of a language, because languages are always changing, it can only do this for about 100, 200, maybe 300 years, 400 years at maximum, before the language itself ceases to become a adequate vehicle of the transmission of culture, right? And the reason this is that after about 400 years, people cease to be able to understand the language of their own ancestors. So this is just one sort of basic observation about the function of language. A second is that language is one of the strongest ways that we signal our cultural identity, the group that we belong to. An example of this would be immigrants that come over to America. Maybe in the first generation, they speak their native language, whether it's Chinese or Italian, and they try very, very hard to pass that on to their children. And that first generation of children born here, they might still identify and say, like, yes, I'm an Italian, or yes, I'm Chinese. But normally by the third or fourth generation, all that's left, especially if the language hasn't been transmitted, all that's left is maybe a handful of recipes and traditions about the origin of our family. And it's really the death of the language in a particular family. We observe the death of that culture, the death of the transmission of that culture, and quite on a literal way, that oftentimes children were not able to speak to their grandparents if they're raised here and the grandparents are monolingual. And so identity is deeply tied to the language that we speak. It's the way that we not only single the group that we identify with, but it's the thing that invites us into participation with that group. And the third thing that I'd like to say about language, before I turn over to Greek and Latin in particular, is that language is something that allows us to create relationships with other human beings. This is, of course, very obvious, but without language, without communication between two souls, between two individuals, you cannot, well, first off, know yourself, and you can't know the person that you're speaking with. And the second we try to put an intermediary between two individuals, whether that's a translator or an interpreter or a commentary, the connection that can occur between the two hearts of two human beings is broken, right? And so we use language on a daily basis to form a close relationship with other human beings. Now, as I said at the beginning of these three observations, language has this function. The vernacular languages have this function on the scale of the century, the decade, the century, perhaps a couple of centuries. But Latin and Greek, these dead languages, fill a different function in our world, and I'll go through each of these. So Latin and Greek, they're dead languages. We sometimes call it that, but what that really means is that they've stopped the process of change, right? So unlike vernacular languages, every couple hundred years become unidentifiable. Greek and Latin, more or less, have stayed the same for the entirety of their history, and there's many reasons for that, but a lot of it has to do with the early creation of the classics, the creation of a canon to which all subsequent authors would have reference when they were composing their texts.
Yeah.
So Greek and Latin became technologies for the transmission of culture that exceeded the perspective of the century.
Yes.
That if you would like to be able to preserve knowledge for a millennium or for 2 millennia or for 3 millennia, that you would need a vehicle to create a community that exists across time, not just across a couple of centuries. Latin and Greek, in particular, these become, I mentioned earlier that the language is one of the ways that we single our identity to a group. When I think about what it means to be a member of the West, and not just right now, but across the last 2 millennia, the way that for century after century that we have singled our participation in what is the West is by speaking in a certain way and by learning the languages of Greek and Latin. It was through the learning of the languages of our ancestors that we identified ourselves. It didn't matter if your native language was English or German or French or Italian, right? But that everybody across the entire European continent became part of one family that existed at that moment in time, but then also existed in the centuries that came before it.
Yeah.
And the third element, as I mentioned, is the creation of friendships, or the creation of personal connection between other human beings. And now this is something that Petrarch writes about absolutely beautifully, that Petrarch himself, and you've probably heard me speak about this before, saw the ancients as not just people that, marble busts that you put up on a pedestal in a museum, but he saw them as interlocutors. He saw them as friends. He wrote letters in Latin to Cicero and to Seneca. He wrote a beautiful dialogue between himself and Augustine, talking about the difficult times that he lived through, and looking to Augustine to help him cure the suffering and depression that he had in his soul, losing all of his loved ones. He really believed that these individuals were his friends, and that they were participants in the same community with him. He really quite literally grafted himself on to this tradition, to this long family tradition. And it really is the Greek and Latin are the languages of the big family that we call the West. And it's so essential for us, if we really would like to enter into that long community that is stretched back for thousands of years, we must learn the languages. And not only do we have to learn the languages in the way that they are usually taught these days, to analyze them and learn all of the grammar, we have to learn them in the way that Petrarch himself learned them, and the scholars of the Renaissance learned them. That is by using them and speaking them, and by revivifying the languages with every breath that we take. It's almost as if when we're speaking Latin or Greek, you can't help but not feel that you are one of this a member of this large community. And I think I'll close by saying that we are now at a time where we've somewhat turned our backs on the past, and I mean that in the Homeric sense. You'll know that Homer and the Greeks themselves believes that we were walking backwards into the future. Why? Because the past is in front of us and we can see the past. These are the obvious things. The future is unknown and it is behind us. And this is how the Greeks conceived of the passage of time. And once we turn our backs on the past, we're actually, we're not just singly blind, we're now doubly blind, because we can't see what's in front of us, right, which was the past, and we don't also still are as equally ignorant about what is going to come. And when we look at figures like Petrarch or Erasmus that are engaged in the process of cultural renewal and renaissance, their ability to look backward is balanced by their ability to look forward. They're constantly looking backwards and forwards in this in a beautiful way, and you can see this in the writings of the humanist scholars, that they're writing in a language that they thought was going to be understood not just 100 years or 200 years or 300 years in the future by their own great grandchildren, but 500 or 1,000 years into the future, that they were writing for eternity. They had a completely different sense of time. But we also see it in the way that things were built. That this is an idea that stretches back to antiquity. This is something that we talked about when we visited the Basilica Cistern in Constantinople, the sewage system of the Great Basilica, which is more beautiful than any building that's built in the last 70 years. It was never meant to be seen. It was just filled with water. It was just sort of an accident that we discovered it. And if your sewage system outlives your civilization by 1,000 years, right, and it's more beautiful than anything that we can produce, it says something about the way that these individuals thought about their place in time, right? They were equally connected to the future, the millennium that's coming, as they were to the past. And the only way to really do that is if we share a common language. If there's no intermediate, there's no sense that I'm going to fear that some of the things that I write now are going to be misunderstood by people 500 years or 1,000 years into the future. And it's through the cultivation of Latin and Greek, not just as scholarly tools, but as things that we actively use in our own lives, that we can then lay the foundation for the building of this community, because no community can really exist without a common language and without a sense of appreciation and friendship, with the sense of true friendship and appreciation for everything that we have, all the benefits of our society that have been given to us, that we have that we ourselves have not participated in creating. And by learning these languages and by reading Plato and Petrarch and Cicero in the original, we begin to see them as people that were just like one of us. I often say that we speak Greek, ancient Greek and Latin here as the analogy, right? That if I can speak this language with someone in the here and now as a friend, I can also then take that relationship to the past and begin to read Plato as an individual, not to be worshipped or to be discarded, but as another human being who is trying to figure out what it means to be a body that has this eternal soul stuffed into it, and all the difficulties that come with it, and that was trying to save some knowledge for posterity. There's no real way that I see to do that, to reform our perspective and our orientation to the past, then through learning the languages and being able to see these other individuals that have come before us for thousands of years as our friends, as people that we can walk with and grow with and learn with. Thank you.
Thank you all very, very much. We're astonishingly running on time here, which is a good thing, because we have a lot to come. We have now a few minutes, 15 minutes or so, for questions, interventions. This is being called a round table. Of course, round table is sort of metaphorical when there's no table in the room, let alone a round one. But I want you to imagine that we are all of us around a single table. So that it's a moment not simply for asking questions of those of us who've spoken today or who will speak, but to make interventions of yourselves, observations, conjectures, and so on and so forth. So I want to moderate from up here. I'll move myself back just a little bit so I can see the panelists up here, and take any, whether from any of you gents here or anyone out here. Let's have at it. So Mihaela first, please. And then Lydia will give you a little Instamic so you can be captured for the audio for all posterity.
All right then.
Speak in Latin.
Yes. Yeah, you better speak in Latin or Greek, though, or they may not understand you.
My Greek
5 minutes
knowledge.
from now. Go ahead, Mihaela, please.
I thought the midterm was next week.
Actually, stand up if you would, so others can hear you. Make sure everyone in the back can hear whatever you have to say.
So I just have a question about the best places to focus on this sort of renewal and renaissance. I think a lot of a lot of these things have also been kind of running through my head as I've been trying to decide what am I doing in the next several years of my life, like what am I going on to, and like I guess some spheres that I can see like action happening in. I mean, there's the political sphere, there's the familial sphere, like as a mother or a father, there's an educational sphere. What are the best ways and best spheres to approach this sort of renaissance in?
Well, leave it to a Ralston student to ask an impossible question. And maybe I'll take a very quick stab at that. I'll simply say, on the one hand, you're going to hear an argument today about the spheres that we need to make interventions in, whether they're philosophical, theological, architectural, philological, and so on and so forth. And I think that that's one of the purposes today, is to come to terms with the action we need to take on the one hand. On the other hand, I think at the level of the individual, it is so important to be true to the guiding lights and talents and abilities and frameworks and history that you yourself have, because that opens up a particular way forward that only you can take and only you must take. So I think somehow holding those things together is very fundamental. But I welcome, this is meant to be conversational here, so please. And please, Jim.
If I could just make one comment. I have this question, people ask me this all the time because I'm a professor. And one of the things I say is that you should find someone who you admire, someone whose work you admire, and be inspired by that. That's the way the classical tradition works. The most popular author in the classical tradition for many centuries was Plutarch. People read those inspiring accounts of great men. I'm afraid they all are great men. But there's no reason why we can't be inspired, even if you're a woman, by a great man. This seems to be a doctrine of our time, that you have to be inspired by a woman, but it's perfectly possible to be inspired by a great man. And find someone that you really admire, and if it sings to you, if that person's excellence, his virtue, her virtue, her excellence sings to you, then you try to do that. You look within yourself. Can I do this too? What training do I need in order to get into this? It might be a doctor, it might be a politician. Well, probably not a politician, but it might be some cultural figure, some poet, some architect whose work you admire. You say, I want to do that. That's what I want to do.
Beautifully said. Questions, comments, interventions?
Is
Yes,
that?
please.
Thank you all for your wonderful comments today. I was curious if, on a sort of practical level, how does one actually engage in the public square today? And then on a sort of broader scale, what is the proper orientation of the academy to society broadly? Because I think we would all agree it's a little out of shape right now, but it's not entirely clear to me what that orientation ought to be.
Perhaps James
Gladly, yes, I'm happy to speak to that. I mean, I think, look, I said earlier that crisis is a time of opportunity, and I think there really are opportunities. I think we're in an extraordinary period of flux, obviously, to understate things somewhat, both politically and culturally. I mean, in my own country, in the UK, we're seeing the leading right-wing political movement since 1834 now regularly coming third in the nationwide approval rating. That's the first time it's happened in nearly 200 years. For the first time in 100 years, it is the case that the duopoly has broken. And now, of course, a lot of people are getting terrified by this. It's all chaos, and Britain's going down the plug hole. It may well be going down the plug hole, but I mean that is a time of it's a time of opportunity. It's a time of excitement. So specifically to answer your question, I mean, what I advise a lot of my students coming through my little catacomb in Cambridge, a sort of crypto-conservative catacomb on the edges of the Cam. What I try to do very consciously is to mentor them. I mean, as best I can. I mean, I'm not a particularly great writer, but I know great writers, and I'll often introduce them if I think they're up to it and they're ready for it. And there are all sorts of interesting new platforms emerging. which I try to get them published on, and that's actually proven to be quite straightforward on the whole. And some of them have actually gone on to put proposals together and start Substacks and develop a presence in the digital public square at a speed that would have been unthinkable just even 20 years ago. I mean, even the great Douglas Murray I see at the back there, my goodness, even a man of his caliber, it took him, it took a long time. You were in the trenches back in the early noughties when we were leaving university. That's not the case now. The real talent is rising faster, is rising to the top at a rate that we haven't seen in a long time. On the political side of things, I mean, I can't speak to the American situation. We're doing our best in the universities to incubate conservative talent, more mainstream conservative talent, some dissident conservative talent. We're looking for any solutions we can. And the way I do it is through the Edmund Burke Foundation, the National Conservatism Movement, NatCon. But that's not the only vehicle. I think it's the best and most successful right now. But there are other opportunities, and I think actually we were at the big conference back in Washington in July, and I was struck by the number of talented young people coming through, fizzing with interesting policy ideas, informed by deep rootedness in the canonical tradition of the great sort of Hebraic and engine rooms of Western civilization. And there was so much excitement in that room. I mean, half of them are now in the White House, of course. So I mean, there was a sense of electricity and excitement that was foreign to a Brit who'd just come over from the worst drubbing delivered to any right-wing party in about 100 years. But there will be, nation-specific solutions to that. But I think it's an exciting time to be confident and to take risks and cast your bread upon the waters.
If I may say so, Dr. Orr has given us just in the last hours quite a brilliant example of what it means to intervene in the public space as a member of the Academy. Of course, he's a philosopher, theologian, University of Cambridge. On the plane on his way over here just hours ago, he wrote a piece on the Ordo Amoris, which was in response to something of a dust-up between the Vice President of the United States and another interlocutor online in the space of X, formerly Twitter. James put together just an absolutely incandescent reflection on this theological question, and it's such a good example of how the non-instrumental, apolitical world of the theological gives him, in this case, the firepower to speak to fundamental human questions that were happening at that very moment in front of millions of people. So thank you for that, James. That was published in First Things magazine this morning, if I'm not mistaken. Any other responses to this question about university in the public sphere, shall we? Oh, yeah, David, please.
Just a couple of sentences building on what James said. When I was tracing the arc of the college, I sought to point out that it was monastic in the sense of being a walled community that made external interference minimal. And that is very important. But I want to be clear that one of the beauties of a college on the principles I outlined is that there are three modes of changing society. There's the changing the individual within the institution, transformationally. There's changing the sector of higher education by virtue of modeling good teaching and humanist inquiry properly, such that other institutions follow. But then there's the relationship with the public at large, who delegate trust in rigorous, excellent communities of learning. The public are intrinsically inspired by great colleges, even if they themselves have no scope of being within them. So I think we need to be confident about sealing ourselves off from transient interferences in the wider world, but realizing that in so doing, we will change the world around us for the better in our terms.
Dr. Collins.
So one of the ways I like to think about this is in the figure of Pythagoras in particular. Aristotle says that there's three types of rational beings. There's man, there's God, and then there's Pythagoras. And one of the superpowers that Pythagoras was purported to have is being in two places at once. And I think that one of the reasons that this was the case is that there seemed to be two different type styles, beings of Pythagoras. There was the one on the island of Samos who retreated into the cave, who was reflecting and communing with the gods and listening to the harmony of the spheres and the celestial music. And there was the other in southern Italy who was in a walled community, but who was also a little bit more politically and socially engaged in what was going on in Croton at the time. And it does seem to be the case that those are the two. And there's another way of thinking about the two fundamental threads of the academy. On the one hand, there's that individual reflection and study that needs to be done either in solitude or in relative solitude. And then there's the sort of the communal aspect of being part of a community of scholars, which then can also be a little bit more outward facing and looking towards towards societal and social reform. It does seem to be the case that we've neglected more so the first one in what's going on in the academy right now, and that there's certainly not as much of the spelunking Pythagoras listening to the harmony of the world and the cosmos, and everybody's rushing to get to the second mode of Pythagoras, which is changing society and making social interventions. Well,
Thank you very much. Please, Jeff.
Yes, to that point of what we can do about the public sphere, there is a very powerful movement now to create civic centers in universities. They're being set up by state governments. So I'm currently at the one at Hamilton College in University of Florida. I'm just there for the term. But they're trying to create, as it were, Trojan horses, as the Renaissance would have said, within the university, and to create what we're doing at the University of Hamilton Center is teaching all the stuff the university refuses to teach anymore. So we're teaching military history. I was taught military history. We're teaching diplomatic history. We're teaching authors that are taught, like Dante, for example. And we're plugging all the holes in the dike that all the Western tradition is coming out of the university. We're trying to create a wall around that. And there's one, I mentioned the one in Florida, but there's also one in North Carolina now. Jen Atkins is running that, and there's one, there are 5 that were founded in Ohio. There's one in Dallas, the Civitas Center, and some of Princeton has had the Madison Center for a long time. But I believe there's something like 12 different civic centers that have been created in the last 5 years to bring the traditions of Western civilization and American government that have been neglected by the modern university, to create a home for them, perhaps a fortress for them in the center of many universities, and the movement is spreading.
Thank you. Myred is going to have to beware of geeks bearing gifts. I'm a geek. I'm a proud geek. I love science.
Please, Pablo.
When I was listening to this conversation, I was thinking that truth indeed does not need any protection. For if truth needed protection, then it would not be true. Truth has dragons by its side. And that what actually needs protection is a man's devotion to truth. That a man can be devoted to truth. And I'm thinking of a line in the Phaedrus, and if I say it
So you're not
incorrectly,
asking
please
a
correct me.
question. That's what it is.
That what friends share is what they have in common. And so I have a hesitancy of how do we make sure that we do not make enemies of people who can be friends?
You could have just said that.
Just first say in relation to your first point, which I think is such an important one, and that what is real and the patterns of reality. There's nothing we can do to change them by definition. So I think in that sense, the truth needs no defense. I mean, the whole tradition of the Greek tragedies is about people running afoul of fundamental principles or balances in reality, and they end up dead or destroyed. That's true now as ever, that you might say the inevitability of reality, or of the divine justice, as the Greeks would have put it. On the one hand, on the other hand, that's precisely why we need to understand those things, so we can locate and find ourselves within them and act in ways that are productive coherent, and so on. But in relation to the question you pose,
Just very quickly, you might say truth always buries its undertakers. And we've seen the sort of the high noon of post-structuralism, relativism, and its solvent acid going crashing down like a waterfall across the public square and the institutional life of the West these last, 50, 60 years. And that has induced a kind of existential torpor within the universities. The universities have become multiversities. Let's just say that is, they've become with the dictatorship of relativism and this just the assault on truth before it resurrects itself, as it were. They've become, as it were, completely fragmented.
I think you use as it were too much.
Dedicated bands of friends,
As it were.
who can reach across the different disciplines, reach across the different universities, can link hands from Geneva to what's left of Rome, to Wittenberg, to Munster, to go back to my earlier schema, which we can all do in this room at a level, at a rate that is quite extraordinary. You brought up the Phaedrus. I mean, one special theme in the Phaedrus, of course, is this terror of technology, the technology of writing, crystallizing, fossilizing. It strikes us as odd these days that the Greeks, at their very peak, were very suspicious of the very medium by which we now know by which they endured. But there was an irony there. As soon as Homer is written down under the instructions of Pisistratus in the mid-6th century, Homer stops that wonderful evolution of the oral tradition that is the Iliad. Because it's frozen. It's this terrible paradox that it's the freezing that helps us, that makes it endure, but of course the creativity is stopped. What's the point of that? I think one element we should be more open to is harnessing the power of technology and not being terrified by it. It's true that technology disrupts and dissolves and has generally been structurally opposed to those who are more on the conserving side of sort of institutional renewal. But we need to, there are opportunities that I touched on earlier, and we need to think hard about how we harness the energies of the past through technology to as part of this project of Renaissance.
And I'll just say, thank you, Dr. Orr. Pablo, just very quickly, I'll say that, I think you put your finger on really one of the fundamental questions of our moment, which is how those who might be friends become friends rather than, aliens or alienated from each other. And, I think that the dominant, in some sense, or until recently, for a long time, at least ascendant worldview, whether we want to call it nihilistic or neo-Marxist or whatever the language we might put on it, claims that there are no higher order goods that we share, right? It's endless atomism and fragmentation and deconstruction all the way down. Whereas in fact, the entire tradition, I think simply the facts of nature, that the human being is made such that we can together have a shared horizon because we have reason, we have love, we have knowledge, we are able to understand and grapple with a shared reality that opens up a shared horizon. It's precisely that unveiling again of the shared horizon that I think is so important in our time. I'm going to welcome now Mr. Greg Hurwitz, who's a writer, a screenwriter, a novelist, a thriller writer, a writer of comics, and so on and so forth. Over to you, Greg.
Thank you so much. I must confess, after this murderer's row of thinkers, I feel a bit like Elizabeth Taylor's sixth husband. I know what I'm supposed to do. I'm just not sure how to make it interesting. I would like to thank Dr. Conlon for at least lowering the bar and transition to an American accent. Stephen, I love the metaphor of the oak trees and the acorns. And I think that one of the things we're doing here is trying to figure out how Ralston and the people here and the people of Ralston and the rest of us can wind up being mighty oaks rather than squirrel food. And the key, as I see it, is that we all have to have roots in the dirt. We have to always have contact with reality, because when that fails, we don't have anything. So we're in a populist moment right now, but only sort of. We certainly have distrust of the people, by the people, and for the people. But I think of it a little bit differently. That we're in this cultural moment where the perpetuation of our supposedly shared beliefs, our values, or ideas can no longer be taken for granted. They must be embodied and championed, and their continued purchase must be earned. If we want them to reflect what is high, we better ensure they are comprehensible on the ground. If we hope they embody what is good, we have to ensure that we embody what is good, and that embodiment is evident, inspiring, and attractive to the real world. Because when we remove ourselves from reality, we float up into the abstract, and we become intellectually masturbatory. We trade on inside jokes and faculty lounge jargon, sealing ourselves in a cocoon of superiority and sanctimony, where we cease to convey and compete, where we ossify. Reality is where ideology goes to die. To have that which is highest and best, it must remain connected all the way down. It must be able to resonate through all quarters. And this is something I think a lot about in my career. I'm a writer of commercial fiction, crime fiction, thrillers. I have a series called Orphan X about an assassin trained in an off-the-books program buried deep beneath the DoD. And I describe my main character, Evan Smoke, as a blue-collar Renaissance man. And I, in fact, borrow a phrase from the OSS, the predecessor of the CIA, who said their ideal recruit is a PhD who could win a bar fight. So essentially, their ideal candidate was Joe Conlon. And Evan Smoke is indeed highly educated, but what do we mean by education? He's learned to scream at knife fighting, sniping, and demolition breaching. He studies military history and contemporary psyops. He learns nuances of foreign cultures, languages, and etiquette. But the reason for all of this learning is the same. If he's deep undercover and gets anything wrong, he will die. All of his learning is staked to the dirt. It can be glorious and compelling, sure, but he knows what he knows primarily, so he won't get killed. Of course, it's my aim to imbue my books with literary quality and narrative depth. But like my character, they can't merely jostle their way through an arid world of tote bag critics.
That's a good
My novels
point.
also have to compete evolutionarily. It's a kind of reproductive fitness aimed at producing more offspring off the presses. There's no differentiation between my reaching for highest possible artistic quality, the broadest reaching public, and prosperity. They're all the same. So why not aim at all of them? Isn't that what the greats have always done? It's not like Homer's goal of goals was to get the Odyssey published in a peer-reviewed literary journal subsidized by Vassar. Which, of course, that doesn't make sense since Homer was Greek and Vassar is in Poughkeepsie. But the point holds. The Bible, you talk about a perennial bestseller. When we think of Dickens or Hitchcock, we never ask the question, were they a commercial success or critical success? They embody both of them. After college, in case my aspirations of becoming a novelist didn't pay off and I needed surefire employment, I decided to acquire a master's degree in Shakespeare and tragedy. And I often get asked, why does a Shakespeare scholar, more like a Shakespeare dilettante, write thrillers? And the answer is, Shakespeare wrote narrative-driven, highly structured tales of lust, intrigue, and murder designed to put asses in seats and sell at the Globe Theatre. If you cut the Globe Theatre in half, it's a dollhouse view of a perfect cross-section of Elizabethan society. And the way that he modulates in tone and humor addresses that. He'll have a glancing reference to Ovid's Metamorphosis for royalty, and then he'll make a glancing joke about impotence for the groundlings. He's constantly moderating between all of these things. His aspiration, his top aim, quite literally, was to sell out. Literary cross-pollination between the popular and the profound abounds. Camus drew his inspiration for The Stranger from James M. Cain's The Postman Always Rings Twice, the great noir classic.
I didn't know
I was
that.
rereading Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment recently, published in 1866, and I was halfway through and I had this inkling. I was thinking, there's no way that this guy didn't read Edgar Allan Poe. And I went through the notes, and sure enough, I found that he was a very big fan of Edgar Allan Poe. Telltale Heart, published in 1843.
That's weird.
So here you have guilt and emotional paranoia driving a murderer to confession, conveyed through two means. And what a lovely synergy between the inventor of the mystery, Poe's truly the inventor of the modern mystery, and perhaps the greatest psychological novelist of all time. In the preface to Dorian Gray, Oscar Wilde famously remarks, "There's no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. Books are well written or badly written. That is all." So perhaps we can paraphrase, there's no such thing as highbrow art or popular art. Art is good or bad. That is all. And when
Absolutely.
it's great, it's both highbrow and popular. And
Absolutely.
as for commercial considerations, they too are as old as time. It's not like Michelangelo could paint whatever the hell he wanted on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. He had to answer to the head of the studio, Pope Julius II. And so here we are now at the start of a new renaissance of sorts, if we don't screw it up. There's a fresh air of optimism, a sense of high human possibility across the arts. And if culture is the soil that we live in, it's time for us to consider what seeds should we plant. So perhaps we could ask ourselves, what is highest and best and most widely received? And I propose that those three considerations form a new trinity that will join us in community and help us understand ourselves better, who we are and what we want to aim at. So what does this mean about Ralston? Ralston is by definition elite. 26 students selected out of 11 million applicants. You all teach courses in languages I can't read, and I went to Harvard and Oxford back when that was still something to be proud of. But what else do you have at Ralston? You have carpenter painters and horse breakers. You have trumpeters and architects, farmers and fishermen and filmmakers. As students, you're tasked with more than just sniffing rarefied air. You're tasked with carrying principles and patterns forward in your real life, in your real relationships, in your real communities. The fundamental questions, truth, beauty, mortality, justice, have purchase in the real world. And the responsibility of Ralston graduates and of anyone who touches this community is to go forth as school teachers and entrepreneurs, soldiers and publishers, veterinarians and computer engineers, to plant seeds, to grow the culture wider and stronger, to ensure that the virtues prosper and propagate. Best, highest, and most attractive. That's not just Stephen Blackwood. It is the responsibility and the goal for all of us to identify, judge, embody, and carry our learning far and wide into the world. Thank you.
That was good.
Thank you so much, Greg. You'll see that in the structure of this roundtable, that the second half, if it was in the first, we were talking, you might say, about what happens within the garden, within the walls of the monastery, how and why that is fundamental. We're moving now into how that moves into the world. And I'm going to, from our writer, Greg, move now to the icon carver, YouTube sensation, symbolic theologian, John Joe.
Yeah, sometimes I'm a little difficult to describe. One of the reasons why I'm difficult to describe is because I would say my entire life is leading up to something that Ralston is showing me. Yeah, I dropped out of academia a very long time ago. In the 90s, I studied fine art at the University of Concordia in Montreal. And everything that's happening now, all the madness of the postmodernism playing itself out in all our institutions, was already there in the artistic world in the 1990s. And I saw the rot as I was participating in it, and I pulled out. And of course, it led me through a whole time of crisis.
Yeah.
But everything that I've done has been a sense that I'm preparing for this renaissance that everybody here is talking about. And one of the reasons why I keep coming back to Ralston, and why, for some odd reason, I don't like Greg said, I don't speak Greek, I don't speak Latin, I'm not an academic, but I can see something alive when I recognize it, because I've been looking for it for 25 years. There's a crazy pattern in the Bible. One that it's probably one of the hardest patterns to understand, because it seems so harsh. It's that before something begins, you have horrible things that happen before the beginning. And you see it repeated over and over, right? Of course, the flood is the greatest example where all of humanity is eliminated and that the remainder, the memory of what is human is gathered into the small seed in order to cross the waters of chaos to be able to be planted again. But that pattern happens over and over in the Bible. And so the Hebrew children have to be massacred by Pharaoh, so that out of the massacre of those Hebrew children, one child pops up, becomes the gathering of all of that memory into that one person, and becomes the seed by which a new world will begin. But keep looking at the story. It happens over and over. Joshua and Caleb, the entire people that left Egypt died, and only 2 are left to cross over again a body of water to enter into the promised land, right? And we see it happen, of course, in the story of Christ, where Christmas has a dark side. Everybody knows that because it's the massacre of the innocents, which is happening simultaneously as the Messiah is being revealed, as the light is happening. And, you know, you kind of have to understand it as a pattern of being, that that's actually just how the world works. You know, things have to be raised to the ground in order for a new beginning to appear. And we've been watching the institutions fall apart and fall to rot and fall to corruption. We've been watching it happen for, you know, at least in my perception, 25 years, because that's when I was there. And it takes a while for that to happen, but that becomes the compost. Like the thing has to rot, it has to fall down, it has to fall low so that a seed can be planted. And there's a reality, which is this gathering together that only comes in the crisis of watching things fall apart. You don't even want to do it unless you see how things are so dire that we need to gather things together towards a seed. And if you look at those moments of origin in the Bible, these moments of new beginnings, they have a characteristic. They're not arbitrary. They are, I like to call them something like moments of active remembering. So when Moses leaves Egypt and he goes out into the wild land and has that first encounter with God, we always have to remember that God presents himself as I am, as being itself, revealing itself to him, but also I am the God of your fathers. So it's a gesture of active memory. You see that happen in the story of Jonah. The same thing happens. Jonah is now down at the bottom. He's dead. He's in the monster. He's at the bottom of the world, the gates of Sheol, and he remembers God. He said, I remember your holy place. And that thrust, that drive, is what makes it possible for him to come out of the waters in order to have a new beginning. And that's what, you know, when I came to Ralston, you know, Stephen just invited me to come and see, and I was like, okay, I'll come and see this. And I saw exactly that happening, which is the type of remembering that we need to do. Of course, there's a scholarly aspect to it that's important. There's a preservation part of it, which is important. But there's also a manner in which it has to be living, has to be alive. And when I met the students that are learning to speak ancient Greek, that are learning to speak now ancient Latin, that are thrust into a world, that have to go to the cave of Pythagoras, that have to, you know, to encounter these spaces, I realized that this is something very different. Like, they're not forming scholars. They are forming those new beginnings, those seeds that will bear fruit in the future as we watch things fall apart. And that's why I was so attracted to it. Now, the problem is that it looks really complicated when you look at it from the outside. Like, why is he going through so much trouble? It's so much trouble to bring these people to Greece, spend months there, you know, to then want to create a place like here, to make it beautiful, to make it something which in itself, you know, if you've been to the Ralston buildings, you can see in the Ralston buildings an act of active memory. That's what they're doing. They're saying we have to make all of it coherent. If we're going to build an arc, if we're going to build something that is bringing it together, it has to happen at every level. It reflects a little bit what Greg was saying, which is you can't, like, if, let's think about it this way. Ralston could not be an online program. It just can't. Why? Because it has to embody, it has to gather reality together. It has to be the college that we heard about this morning. It has to be the gathering of the people into a particular space that has a name that can be identified in space and time. And then it becomes like an arc. Then it becomes like the holy place that can receive the revelation, that can receive the new light that comes down onto it. But you need all those things to come together. And it looks, like I said, it looks like, wow, like if you, sometimes you describe Ralston to other people and they're kind of bewildered, like, what is this? Like, what are they doing? Or what's the point of all of this? But once you understand that, then you can see that happening. And now when you think about it, you look back at every single moment of Renaissance, of rebirth, of renewal that happened in the past, and you will see that they all have that characteristic. They all have the characteristic of an active remembering, which is also connected to collegial bringing together and a specific place. There has to be a holy ground, or else it doesn't work. Think of even the subversive ones, right? Think of Paris. Think of Manhattan after World War II as these places of bubbling where people are coming together and are creating the next generation. The other question I've asked myself is, like, why does it have to be like, why are we teaching young people? Why couldn't it just be a fraternity, something where you're pulling together great people like we have here to discuss? It's like, no, that's not enough, because what we're looking for is that new beginning, right? It's not just about coming together to create great art or great literature or great scholarship. That has to seed. It has to become the future. And so that's why I continue to be engaged with Ralston. That's why I really believe in the project, and I'm amazed by what I see. And you can see, that something's real. Like, there, especially if you've been waiting for a very long time to see it happen, and because you start to notice the gathering, it's almost happening, like this call that is being sent out, and then you see the people that care for the right things, that have the right order of loves, are starting to notice each other across the hall, and they're starting to move in the same direction, and are finding themselves in the same place like we have today. But that has to happen. Like, it's a real thing. It cannot, I don't think that it can actually be an online abstract network of that. Now, from that, we can reach out. Obviously, everything is available to us once we have the core. Once we have the core, then the space can radiate. Once we have the tabernacle, once we have the space that's gathered together to receive that light, then you can move out and you can be online, you can have podcasts, you can do all of that. But this is crucial, and I think that we are witnessing the future, and it's not just happening at Ralston, And I think a lot of people that are here are noticing that it's kind of happening, right? This is the moment, and it's normal because everything else is collapsing. Right? It's not arbitrary. It's a moment that is coherently there to make those that want the highest good start to see each other and move toward each other and build things together. And so I thank Stephen for what you're doing and everybody who's involved in Ralston, and I pray for the great success of Ralston also.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, as we move through the seeds in the world, from the inside the walls to outside the walls. It's such a pleasure to welcome the composer Samuel Andreev.
Oh, nice. I have two paintings of
Thank you.
him.
It is such a pleasure to be in this bright and beautiful place with all of you today. I'm going to start by echoing some of the comments of Greg Hurwitz. He talked about the necessary interplay between the popular and the sophisticated in the arts, and that is absolutely right. It's certainly quite true of my own art form, which is that of music. There's always been in the Western musical tradition a productive tension, you might say, between the savant style and the popular style. You need both of those. And of course, there's a degree of elasticity there. You can go a little bit farther in one direction or in the other. This art form can tolerate that. But when it goes too far in one direction or too far in the other and stays there for too long, and when you stop having any kind of connection or any kind of dialogue between those two, then the art form begins to wilt. And that's actually an indirect paraphrase of a remark by Ezra Pound, who said that when music strays too far from the dance, it wilts. And there's a lot of truth in that. Music is a very peculiar art form in many respects because it's at the same time a completely embodied physical art form, embodied because two of the main parameters of music are melody and rhythm. Melody by way of the breath, melody being an extension of speech, and rhythm by way of the feet. So it's a very much a physical embodied art form, but it is also an intensely abstract one. Music is made up of vibrations in the air. It's not tangible. It has no particular material reality, and it's made up of patterns. Very strange, as we have these two things that coexist in
Life
music.
is made of patterns.
The Western musical tradition, the things that distinguish it from other musical traditions in the world, is founded upon the notion of polyphony and counterpoint. And these are things that have developed in large part because of the existence of written music notation, the five-line staff, and the possibilities that affords us of creating these beautifully complex and rich textures, consisting of individual lines, autonomous lines, that can exist together in a coherent context. And that I see as being the fundamentals of this art form. You would think that would be straightforward and obvious, but just like everything else as we're seeing, that too is under attack these days. And the art form has unfortunately become unmoored. And what I'm noticing in my field is that the teaching, the training of composers is completely inadequate. It's very strange because in music, of course, there are professional training programs for performers, which are at an extraordinarily high level. In fact, I think you could argue that the standards for performing musicians now are higher than they've ever been in history. Performers are incredibly well trained, by and large. Composers, not so much the case. I don't exactly understand why this is. But instead of learning the art of counterpoint and harmony and so on, and all of the sort of technical set of tools that composers need to master, instead it's now possible to do programs in contemporary music composition or in experimental music, as is the case in Oxford right now. You can do a master's degree in experimental music. Okay, that's fine. Music is a big world. You can accommodate a vast range of styles. But increasingly, there are students coming out of these programs and others whose knowledge of music begins at around 1970, something like that. And that seems to not be entirely adequate. The good news is there's no reason to imagine that the talent pool has shrunk. On the contrary, if you look at the situation in the
Well,
post-war era,
if you
this
don't
entire
cultivate the
generation
talent,
has been
it will
eviscerated effectively in
shrunk.
a relatively small number of people available to pursue these sorts of art forms. And of course, that's not the case today. There's a flourishing of talent. On the contrary, but the training does seem to be, to me, to be inadequate. There's the kind of a refusal to admit that there may be such a thing as a canon, a body of works, a corpus of works that can be transmitted from generation to generation, and that can give us a certain form of continuity. And on top of that, composers have somehow gotten tangled up in the university system, which is a kind of a strange thing, because when I think about some of the great American artists of the 20th century through all genres, whether it's cinema or photography or composition, poetry, one of the things that characterizes them is their extraordinary independence, their lack of willingness to be put in a box, their willingness also to plow entirely personal pathways. And instead of this, you're seeing this generation of artists whose impulse is to say, where do I sign up to follow the rules? And how can I? It's very odd. They all want to get doctoral degrees in music composition, and they want to frame their music as research. So they're doing what's called autoethnography, which is where you write about your own experience of writing your own piece, and this somehow constitutes a form of research. I'm dubious about this, to say the least. So this is a strange state of affairs, but a lot of composers decided to get into university because they thought that that would be a way for them to be sheltered from the vagaries of the commercial marketplace, right? The idea being that we don't have a kind of system of protection from the nobility. Therefore, the path forward is to become a tenured professor at Princeton or at Harvard and be able to pursue your esoteric musical pursuits without having to worry about whether they're commercially viable or not. And indeed, as Greg Hurwitz has pointed out, the pressures of the commercial marketplace are not exactly something to be sheltered from. They can actually be productive, and they have been throughout the history of music. And you know, if you look at a composer like Beethoven, for example, it's easy to say that someone like Mozart was able to bring together the popular and the savant styles, particularly in his operas, and that's something that is not given to everybody to do in such an extraordinary fashion. Beethoven wasn't quite able to do it, not to the same extent as Mozart. But even Beethoven, even a composer like him, who was in a sense a kind of a 19th century avant-gardist, a composer who was always pushing at the boundaries of what it was possible to do in his art form. You see in a piece like the Grosse Fuge, which is a difficult piece by any stretch of the imagination. It's extraordinarily vehement and dissonant and complex. But he was also able to do the art of joy, right? And he was aware of the necessity of those two things. So my sense right now, looking at the current state of my field, is that composition students would be better off to seek out a composer whose work that they admire and try to work with them privately. And I think that is a more appropriate way to deal with the current situation rather than this kind of urge to jam into these universities that in any case don't offer any kind of pragmatic career prospects to most of them. So now as for the professional environment, once again, there is some good news, which is that more is possible than has ever been the case before. A composer who is skilled at navigating this new digital world can put together a gigantic audience rather rapidly if they know what they're doing. That gives me some measure of hope. There is, again, this sort of diffuse audience that is on a global scale that can make all kinds of things possible. There's crowdfunding. There's all kinds of new models that are very powerful. So it's entirely possible to find a way out of this malaise, but I think that it's necessary to adopt a visionary sort of attitude and to see what is now possible, and to not be hesitant about casting off this sort of stale, outworn, inadequate post-war model of public financing and institutional sort of entrenchment of the arts and into something much more vital. And this experience here at Ralston gives me that hope. This is such a beautiful thing to see. It's like an extraordinary dream. And I thank you very much for the invitation to speak here.
Nice.
Thank you so much, Mr. Andreev, for those wonderful remarks. Next, we have the architect and urban planner and Savannah legend, Christian Sotil.
Okay.
Thank you, Stephen, and it's certainly an honor to be here. I feel like what I wanted to talk about today really could just be summed up in one word, and it's a word I'm obsessed with. And it's a word that resonates deeply with the Ralston enterprise, but that word is beauty. Beauty. We need to talk about beauty loudly, openly, and often, more than ever. So I've come from the practice. I appreciate being part of this practice panel. I'm humbled to be here. I'm actually kind of in the right order because architecture usually comes last in this conversation. But I will, what I'd like to do is just share some observations, things I've learned in the course of professional practice as an architect, as a town planner, We're involved with the making of places, and I think I've come to realize how profoundly important place is. It is the vessel for our existence, and if we are surrounded by beauty, it will lead us to virtuous things. It'll make us stand up a bit straighter as we walk through the door of a properly proportioned building.
Yes.
So there's an immense importance to the role of architecture as one of the most public of the arts, one of the most expensive of the arts too, which led me to think about this idea of Renaissance and how ideas move through culture. This was actually an observation from a friend named Jeff Ely, a professor. He told me this years ago, and it really stuck with me, and I think it's true. That ideas move, new ideas enter into a cultural context, and they move usually in about the same order through the arts. So we think about the application. They usually start in literature. Words, talk is cheap, right? It doesn't take a huge investment to try out a new idea verbally, and then it makes its way maybe into music, into drama, into painting. Okay, now there's a commission, there's work being done here, sculpting, and so on. And so you sort of make these ideas that change the world, they make it to architecture usually pretty late, and actually even later town planning, because these are the highest investments. You've got to really be behind this idea to fund it. So I always kind of take that, and we noticed that even in the dissolution of culture in the last century, the deconstructivism of the 1960s really doesn't make its way to architecture till the 1980s and 90s. If you think about the poster child for deconstructivism, Frank Gehry, the right man at the right time, it needed time to make its way into actually, being proven in the built environment. So it's a long process, but how do we short circuit that process? I think that's what we're all really keenly here to talk about. Another good friend, a fellow named Mark McDonald, who is head of Georgia Trust, said something about how we restore places, in his case, from a historic preservation point of view. But he said, Christian, it takes as long to fix something as it did to break it. I thought, ooh, that's kind of a downer, but as you think about it, we were breaking our cities for the last 50 years. It might take 50 years to rebuild them. So I think if we put that in perspective, we realize we're part of a larger project. And I think we all sense we're at a moment of rebuilding. So we have work to do. We have to keep the pressure on to keep that process of renewal and restoration moving forward. But how do we accelerate? I guess that's what I'm interested in. We're all here at a time. We all have work to do. How do we, knowing that these things can happen, sequentially, how can we speed them up? So when we look at where this has happened before, previous Renaissance projects, and where we've seen that, it seems like there is usually an alignment of artists, thinkers, and patrons. I mean, that's it. I actually spent a lot of time growing up in Florence, Italy, and so there clearly you see, the enlightened patronage of the Medici, and you see this sort of alignment with an artistic and a thought culture there, or maybe in Vicenza, where Trissino, this leading humanist, is patronizing Palladio, taking the stone carver and elevating him to give a much larger voice, or maybe the Vienna Secession with Otto Wagner et al. Sort of reacting against the machine of the industrial world. So these are all very definable places, and I think that's interesting. We go back to those places where cultural fusion is happening. They are places. They're not happening online. I appreciate you saying that. I think they happen in definable places where these ideas are sort of melded and built together with this dialogue that reaches across the spectrum of philosophy, theology, and the arts. So I would submit without reservation that Savannah is such a place. And I'm so deeply thankful and grateful that the Ralston project is happening here in Savannah, because this is a place of Renaissance. This is a place of beauty. And beauty is a precondition of a Renaissance, the Renaissance that we were talking about. And beauty is, I think, particularly important as you think about the hierarchy of or is there a hierarchy of beauty and goodness and truth?
Painting is number one in all of them.
And I think beauty is, in fact, maybe the most important hierarchically. And I say that because it's the one that is the most visceral in our experience. It's the one, actually, this is what my father told me years ago. He said, beauty is how God communicates with us. And I think we understand truth intellectually, but beauty we understand viscerally. It's irresistible. We're drawn to it. And I see this when people come to Savannah just to walk around the city and observe it. Our office is on Jones Street, beautiful cathedral canopy of live oaks, and every single person that walks by stops and looks at it. And sometimes they'll take out their camera because they want to capture it, possess it in some way. But no one told them that this was something they should do. But they had to do it because it spoke to them so deeply. So I think beauty is our secret weapon in all of this. Beauty is the thing that brings us back. It is irresistible, and we have to be making it all the time. We have to be making it in the work that we do. It's the examples of what we do that will make all the difference. And I think in architecture, we have a lot of work to do. There's a lot of ugliness out there, but we have a very fine group of emerging practitioners, classicists. They're out there. We need to bring them back into the public realm. They often hide out and do really great private commissions that no one will ever see. We've got to get beauty back into the public square. There's so much work to do there, but I think it's all connected. I don't want to be last. I want to be in line with the writers and the artists and the sculptors and the thinkers. But I'm so pleased to be here, and let's bring beauty back into the world.
Okay.
I'm overwhelmed. I'm drinking from the proverbial fire hose here. Jonathan said something wonderful, and it's been a recurrent theme, that there can be no culture, no tradition, no renaissance without this movement between generations, this handing on of the baton, this sense that we're looking back, also looking forward. And one of the let's say, the paradigmatic fact of that is that the older need to give to the younger. The transmission of culture is something that the old give to the young. And so we thought that this day would not be complete without hearing from one representative student of this Ralston College community. Mari Utsu is a fellow. She's an alumna. She's graduated in her one-year Master's of Humanities last year, and now she's back as a fellow. And in that sense, she is here to speak, I think, on behalf of her fellow Ralston students, past and present, and to speak to us about how she came here and what she found. Over to you, Mari.
Thank you for that introduction, Dr. Blackwood. So while I don't want to spend the majority of my time re-articulating and reiterating what I'm sure everyone in this room already knows about the very bleak cultural landscape out of which Ralston is paving a new path, I think it would be very remiss of me if I weren't to mention briefly that my life prior to Ralston is in fact a living testament to the lonely and very hopeless reality that many young people are facing today. So I lived through social media addiction, long-term illness from cosmetic surgery that I desperately got in my teen years in an attempt to remedy my insecurities, over-reliance on alcohol and drugs, and disconnected, fragmented, and untrusting relationships, a whole slew of them. And I sought approval and connection essentially in all of the wrong places. And I thought that that external surface economy was the only one available for me to invest in. I wasn't emotionally literate, and I didn't know that I didn't know how to think for myself. I was plugged in, insufferable, misled, empty, and distracted. I knew something was very wrong, but I stumbled around. I declared a bunch of majors. I had that intellectual curiosity, but ultimately I drowned in a river of fleeting mainstream cultural trends. So in undergrad, I was a person who recited increasingly complex ideological mantras and said the political things that I thought peers wanted to hear. My entire existence was fear-based. It was reactive. When I began to get interested in more classical, traditional, conservative ideas, I was met with hostility. I lost my friends and I was at a complete loss for how to mend those relationships and find compassion in them. I wasn't free. Now, contrast all of that with the culture that Rolston cultivates and what I found at Rolston. All of the fears I had about others' responses to my true thoughts in undergrad evaporated immediately upon arrival in Samos, and Rolston's environment generally, which upholds free speech.
Okay.
I could thoughtfully work out in amorphous, half-baked thought without hostility or without fear of being judged, ostracized, or dismissed. This was an epiphany for me, and to not tiptoe around a field of conversational landmines did wonders for me intellectually. I got curious about things, and my curiosity was mirrored and augmented by the open, hopeful, and earnest faces of my cohort members. So our Greek term bonded my cohort through every possible experience with reality: moonlit swims, climbing up to the cave of Pythagoras, learning a language together, of course, dancing at wine festivals, dozens of shared meals, the list goes on. And once in Savannah, our shared language only grew in depth, complexity, sincerity, and significance as we lived together, dined together, read Dante, Augustine, and Homer together. I now find that it's difficult to begin to articulate the fullness of my experience. It overflows completely. It helps if one of my cohort members, Cameron, Eamon, Olivia, is around to help enrich my memory by invoking Wagner, Hegel, or that time we swam in a frigid river in Arcadia and one of us got pulled down. So what was I looking for, and did I find it? This year, I walked into Dr. Bryson's office hours, as I do. Thank you for your patience with me. And I said, you know, Dr. Bryson, I think what I wanted to really learn how to be good. Why is it so hard to learn how to be good these days? And, you know, that's what the books were in the service of. It's what Dr. Hankins mentioned in his lecture on Thursday night. Augustine believed that the 7 liberal arts were there in the service of actually understanding revelation, not as ends in themselves. So last year I learned that we ultimately engage with the tradition and traditional culture to reach higher spiritual truths. It's not the Greek itself. It's not the beauty itself. It's not the texts themselves, although those are very important mediators. It's what they allow us to understand about our true selves, how to grow spiritually, and how to properly love each other, how to properly come into relationship with each other and with the world. And interestingly, while I developed in intellectual understanding of the West's foundational culture, I personally began to practice Falun Dafa, a Buddhist-based meditation practice that's currently persecuted in China. I'm grateful to freely practice Dafa in the United States and would often meditate with 2 of my cohort members in beautiful Forsyth Park near the fountain. Ralston's environment naturally encouraged the appreciation of all spiritual truth, which led me to understand that the East and the West are actually in sync in spiritual aspirations. My intellectual, personal, and spiritual growth happened in concert. My personal cultivation increased my appreciation of the West's cultural inheritance and underscored the necessity of helping young people reconnect to it. So like Mr. Hurwitz said yesterday, the time we were given to rekindle this connection to our culture is a very rare treasure. In my view, all people, regardless of cultural background, are the rightful inheritors of traditional divine culture. We are all made in the image of God. So I emerged from the program with lifelong friends, truly deep connections. I talk daily to the friends I made last year. We listened to hundreds of hours of Greek. We began by reading Homer. We ended with Beckett. I wrote over 50,000 words, not counting my footnotes, and got thoughtful feedback on every single writing assignment. My cohort and I shared countless meals, breakfast, lunch, and dinner in Greece, in Savannah, in New York, in pajamas, in black and white tie, in the park. We took our Hegel and Wagner to read in Forsyth. It wasn't just healing or emotionally corrective or fulfilling a therapeutic role. It wasn't just openly exploring embodied, intellectual, spiritual aspects of reality. It wasn't just homemaking and community building. It was all of those via activating traditional culture's riches, connecting to our past, and finding belonging within the tradition, not as critics, but old friends. By returning to the foundations of culture and reconnecting with the metaphysical bedrock we've lost, we created our own culture here. I'm no longer searching for something. I'm sated. I'm full. My orientation has changed to that of giving, of synthesizing the lessons I learned, those of friendship, virtue, faith, right relationship, love, destiny, taking these treasures and sharing them with others who, like me, are lost in a dark wood. Thank you.
Lovely.
Here we are. We have a few minutes now to conclude. Thank you, Mari, for those deeply moving and beautiful remarks. Excuse me. It is now back to all of you to continue this roundtable. I'm going to back up a little bit so that these panelists can see each other. I know we have an infinitely rich store of things that we can converse, discuss, and query together in these next 15 minutes or so before we gather again later tonight for what will be the culmination and capstone reflection of this beautiful day in Douglas Murray's lecture over at the Telfair Academy. So Lydia rather has the Insta mic. If you'd like to make an intervention, ask a question, stand up and do so. Please, Connor, you're next.
Thank you all. In the earlier roundtable, Dr. Butterfield mentioned the mottos of some of the colleges, and Princeton being De Sub Numine Fluget, in the service of God, she flourishes. And an interesting footnote is that it's actually informally changed now to in the service of humanity. And so it's this change from individual flourishing to now sort of this faceless, humanity and service and instrumentalization of the classics. And that was very much the experience, was stripping Plato, stripping the classics for parts in service of something else. And so many of us want to be people such as yourselves, practitioners. And so how do we prevent ourselves from instrumentalizing the classics, and how do we fight back against such instrumentalization?
Okay.
Any pedals here? And I only ask that you stand up. We learned last time it was a little hard for people to hear if we remain seated. So,
Well, I did, one of the things I didn't mention when I was speaking is all the decisions that I made becoming an icon cover, which is the weirdest thing ever. People are like, well, but it was very clearly because I wanted to embody the tradition in an actual practice. I wanted it to be something that was fruitful for the world around me. And in my case, that was the solution that I found. Christian, you said architecture is the last art. I really believe it's the first. City planning and architecture is the first. The reason why it takes so long for the ideas to get there is how fundamental it is. Once it gets there, it's difficult to get back. But I think that's the idea. It's obviously not just up here. It's not just about making aesthetic things or just making things that are interesting or that will titillate us or whatever. But we're like refounding the story of our participation, and that if you can aim it in that direction, and think of all the people, Petrarch, this was real for him. Everybody was dying, everything was falling apart, and he was like, I need to gather this beauty together towards something. And I think now is the best time to do it, because now we do have that crisis. And so if you aim and you gather it together and you walk towards something that is grounded, is not just floating up, then I think it'll happen.
I had a similar, observation about architecture. I had an image of me sitting with my laptop in the rain, typing away with nothing over. It's a Ouroboros. We need the space to create. It has to come first before we can fill it. I think I would say is, I meet countless people who want to be writers, I meet very few people who want to write. And so if the art that you've chosen, if the craft that you've chosen is at the foremost and you love that above everything else, you love that
Yes.
more than vanity or acclaim or money or red carpets, you'll always have a hierarchy. A lot of those things can be fun to indulge from time to time, but in the hierarchy, the doing of the thing has to be, it has to draw you rather than you dragging it behind to get somewhere else with it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Next. Others. Comments, observations, questions, please. Megan.
So I loved sorry. I loved what you guys were saying about trying to find true but you it seems like there is objective beauty in the world, but it seems like if you walk into a modern art museum or a sculpture garden or even like architecture today, it's just kind of weird sometimes. So like there's just like
This is
I feel
how
like
you
our
know
culture has kind of lost
objective
what it
beauty
means to actually,
exists.
like
By
like,
seeing the
they don't
opposite.
know what objective beauty is, and so my question is like, how do you think we can help our culture like come back to an understanding of what objective beauty actually is?
Thank you. That's
Thank you.
beautiful question, and I think the idea that there is objective beauty is so foundational to this. And I think we talk about that hierarchy before of beauty, goodness, and truth. And beauty is the most fragile, and I think that's why it was the one that was attacked first. If you think about how long we've been breaking beauty, a very long time. You had to break it. You had to break beauty before you could break goodness,
Yes.
and before you could break truth. No one would have
Absolutely.
believed that we could actually be questioning truth today, but we started breaking beauty a century ago, and so it's fragile, and no one believes that there's such a thing as objective beauty. However, I don't think, of course, there's an objective beauty, and of course, there's subjective beauty, like de gustibus disputam est, and de veritatis. My Latin is terrible, but of truth that we can discuss. And I find it interesting. I'm often talking about architecture with audiences that are not like this. And we live in such an empirical age. We actually, all these tools are here. And I'm finding that people will listen when you talk about things like objective beauty, when you can say there's actually science that's pointing to this. And particularly in the space of neuroscience and neuroaesthetics. And artificial intelligence is actually forcing this forward because AI wants to know about beauty because it needs something. It needs some rules. It needs some guardrails. It's not maybe an authentic human leap of creativity, but it's actually pointing to things that a majority of people will look at and say, that is beautiful. And then why is that beautiful? And then another punchline is, it's often beautiful because it reminds us of our bodies, or it reminds us of nature. It's like, we have known this. Oh, you all know this already, but it's sort of like this big revelation that we can say, nature is in fact this window into beauty. And when we make things in this world, and those things are correspondent with nature, the proportions of a building or a public space, they remind us of our body and we think they're beautiful. And this is what we're finding. There's an Academy for Neuroscience and Architecture. And they're pointing to the fact that when people say they like this particular building, they're actually seeing a person in that building dimly, the relationship, the ratio. Of course, this has been known for centuries in the Renaissance. The proportion of the face and the cornice of a building, the dental molding, and all those details that just seem right when you see a classical building. It's not because it's a style and isn't that sweet that we've kept it around. It's because it's a direct relationship to nature, and we are using the things that we do in this world with our hands and our bodies as we make our environments to live in. we're doing them in honor of something truly beautiful, and it is very objective. And I think that path, that the fact that science is actually aiding us now to doing that. I would say in architecture, there's been over the last century a real assault on gravity. You know, and, you know, they say gravity, it's not just a good idea. But pick up any magazine, pick up any magazine, and what you're going to see are these gravity-defying buildings. And what's interesting now, again, in neuroscience, we're being shown that when we see things that look dangerous, like the top of this building is twisted or sliding off, and modern art museums are usually, top of the list of defenders.
Yes.
They're designed to create an emotional experience, but not a positive one
Yes.
of danger, sort of fight or flight, instead of this building's at rest, gravity is at work, and I can be calm and I can take this in, and and then I can now decide, is it beautiful or not? Like I'm in a precondition of apprehending beauty. So you have to have that kind of foundational thing, and all those foundational things that are objective tie us immediately back to nature, and in the case of structure and gravity and so forth. So we have to talk openly about that. The beauty is attainable, and we can talk about it, and it isn't just tied to one tradition, but it is sort of a universal condition of human experience, and we need to make more of it. Quick.
Here, here.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Christian. I think Michael, I saw next. This Michael, anyway.
Thank you all very much. I think one thing we've noticed is that universities weaponize young people and their insecurity, because when we're ashamed, we all want to be known. We all want a voice, but there's this weird thing of we don't know who we are yet at this age, and so that's kind of what has been going on in my experience as a high schooler, watching all this content online of universities going absolutely crazy. It's the students who speak the loudest. And so to come back to a point about Moses, he spent the better part of his entire lifetime not as a prophet, but being a shepherd. And so maybe to go back to Mr. Hurwitz's point from yesterday, that at some point you wake up and realize you're the adults, and we have to do something. But when is the right time to start speaking? If we're going to take a humble route and learn from our ancestors, taking maybe 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, who knows? When is the right time to start speaking, creating, whatever it is?
Okay.
I'll just say quickly about that I think that on the one hand, you're always speaking. You're always in relation to people. You're living here in the world with your classmates and your family and your friends, and you have 100 interactions in every day in which you are speaking. And on the other hand, in the sense in which your question is about, when do I enter the public sphere, or when do I think it has to be a matter of your conscience and your careful discernment in the world of what is right for you in the landscape in which you live. Would anyone else like to add to that?
I'd like to advocate briefly for some amount of recklessness and youthful arrogance. It's very difficult to figure out how to speak in the world without starting to do it and screwing it up. It's a bit like writing a novel. I had a meeting one time with a screenwriter who said he wanted to transition to write novels, but he needs to know everything about it because he doesn't like to do something until he knows precisely how to do it. I thought, if you're not willing to start writing a novel and screwing it up beyond compare and then taking it apart like an engine block and seeing how it works, you're not ready to embark on it. And so you clearly have a natural humility and perspective beyond your years, particularly with your contemporaries. And I wouldn't be afraid to stumble forth and you can get out over your skis a bit and you can make corrections, and your humility can come in the corrections and the speed with which you assimilate and accommodate new information also.
Please,
I'd just like to add something about the conversation about beauty. I always think of beauty as a byproduct, as something that issues forth when you do something with love and with skill,
Absolutely.
I don't necessarily set out to create beauty.
Absolutely.
In a
Get the
composition, but
skills.
it's something that can result as a byproduct of those things. If you look through the great museums in Europe, the Prado, the Louvre, you'll see a lot of grotesque. These are
Raft of the
beauty is not
Medusa.
the same thing as pretty, right? You have to make a distinction between those two things. There are beautiful things that are deeply stirring
They're
and affecting.
sublime.
Look at the terrifying paintings of Caravaggio, the scenes of Saint John the Baptist, the awful stuff. But it's so deeply affecting and stirring. And these the paintings, even though they might be frightening, nevertheless they carry this tremendous power. They're deeply stirring, and the beauty, I think, emanates from that, even though they might not be exactly pretty.
Such an important point. Scott next. Thank you.
Follow up on what Mr. Hurwitz said, and on the idea that you should have humility and wait for your timing in order to engage with the classics. You know, Peter Paul Rubens, he collected old masterworks, would actually edit them, would draw over them to improve them. So.
But that was Rubens.
I think that there's a danger in being stultified by too much respect and humility, and you end up being stuck in the past. And people like Rubens didn't look to the past to look to the past. They look to the past to see through their eyes, right? To participate with them as friends in the way Petrarch did. So,
Yes, Professor Hankins.
Yeah, I just had a remark about how to discover beauty from a pedagogical point of view. In the Renaissance, it was a fundamental principle that you begin with imitation. And you start out, you can simply copy passages by beautiful writers.
Absolutely right.
And then you write something that's similar to that, and you try to figure out why it's good. And of course, the rhetorical principle is that you cannot change a single word in a well-written sentence, it becoming worse.
But you have to describe by
You simply copying in a very humble
by
way
experiencing it.
a great writer, Cicero or Virgil, and then you try to imitate in your own way, and then
You
get
understand
together with
why.
other people who are also trying to imitate, and then you have noble rivalry.
Absolutely.
Emulatio generosa, right? And everyone is trying together to write something that's beautiful, and you compete, but in a cooperative way. Competition and cooperation always have to go together, and that is the way for excellence to come out. Because when you're just looking for beauty, beauty has a way of becoming evident to you when you're trying to do it. When you're trying to draw, I think this is something that should really be part of the educational program. It used to be when you learn to write Latin. That's how I learned to write Latin post-opposition. We started out copying passages and everything and so forth. But I think it should apply to all of the arts.
Well said. I'm going to conclude momentarily, but just a couple of quick final. We're going to do three very quickly. Maria first.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for being here. I have a very similar experience to Connors because he went to Princeton, I went to Columbia. I study art history, but I learned no history. There's no story. I agree with Dr. Kahn that language is very important. There's this passage in the Gospel of John that is synagagiteta percepsanta klasmata enamitia polite, means to gather all of the remaining fragments so that none goes to waste. So it seems that the culture, the story is just everywhere. Now we're in a moment that we have to bring it all together. And with Dr. Blackwood now crying when he saw everyone coming together, it's just like this moment of beauty. You can't deny it. You just cry. You go to church and it's just so beautiful. And all you can do is just cry.
Yes.
So I guess my question is, how do we restore this spirit of love for what we're learning? That we're not just trying to impress, we're genuinely interested and passionate about what we're doing. And how do we navigate the modern academia where there truly is no love. It's just images, no beauty. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
I'm going to let that question hang in the air as something that will animate our efforts in the days and weeks and months to come. I think that your asking of that question is in fact already an answer to it, Maria. All of you are. Rodney, and then finally, Michael.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question for Christian, but first I wanted to say, is it Mari? Is that how we pronounce it? I've never heard such a speech of ugliness and despair go to such happiness and love in my life. And you need to get her on any television or any radio as fast as you can. You're a remarkable woman. And I think she deserves an applause again. I think we need to give her a hand again. And Stephen, you and Christian and I have these debates. The gravity thing is pretty funny. And I absolutely believe that too. I'll one up you at the end of my question, but I'll do it now. How about if you go into a federal courthouse that is in an earthquake zone and it's totally looking like it's going to fall on your head? And that is really as strange as it can be. Not only is it anti-gravity, it's just anti-human. I find it really interesting that it is the Nancy Pelosi Federal Courthouse in San Francisco.
Okay, you're getting ridiculous.
So what my question is to you is that, and Stephen, you should have any architect go first, because the attacks on the West started with where we live and where we work. And to make them ugly is not a surprise that the world, particularly the United States, is in the position that it, or that I believe you're referring to, has to do with reintroducing the humanist tradition, classicist and a tradition-based approach to new civic architecture, federal architecture, which was a project that began in the previous Republican administration.
Okay, I'm done with this
an
lecture.
executive order.
Ridiculous shit. Okay.
Welcome to the Ralston College podcast. I'm Stephen Blackwood. In a 1939 play, T.S. Eliot posed the question, where does one go from an age of insanity? 75 years on, this question has not lost its force. Where does
Never
one
will.
go from an age of insanity?
Never will.
Eliot's reply was, one goes somewhere on the other side of despair. In today's podcast, Christopher Snook, a scholar of T.S. Eliot and a poet himself, takes this question and its response as the jumping off point for a beautiful lecture on one of Eliot's greatest poems, indeed one of the greatest poetic works of the 20th century, The Wasteland. The Wasteland arose at the intersection of a personal and cultural crisis as Eliot struggled to make sense of the breakdown and fragmentation of his world, his relationships, and his own psyche in the wake of untold losses. What he produced is a masterful, mournful meditation on the longing for redemption and wholeness amidst fragmentation and decay. The poem's most famous line, "These fragments have I shored against my ruins," captures the essence of Eliot's project, a labor of recovery and discovery in the borderlands between hope and despair. A meditation on a fundamental question, perhaps the fundamental question, whether in the fragments of ourselves and of the world, there is something more. This lecture was given as part of our Masters in the Humanities program at Ralston College, and it's a great privilege to share it with you here. I'm Stephen Blackwood. Thanks for listening.
I was trying to think of a joke with which to begin, but I couldn't. Yeah, I've had a lot of time to prepare, so we'll just start. I just wanted to begin by thanking Dr. Blackwood and Dr. Bryson so much for the invitation to be with you this week. Particularly a joy to be with you with a very dear friend of mine, Alan Hall, and to see a very dear friend and very old friend, Stephen Blackwood. But I also wanted to thank Miss Hilary Tucker for her remarkable patience. I'm not especially timely with email correspondence, so she was very patient with my slow-paced communication. And I also want to thank you all because I will test your patience by the end of this lecture. So thank you. Thank you in advance. I did want to begin, though, by saying that it's a real privilege to explore with you the poetry of T.S. Eliot, partly because he's been a companion of my own for decades now, someone I really encountered first in the company of Alan Hall and Stephen Blackwood many, many decades ago. And he is not an insignificant part of the kind of mental furniture of my own mind, which has largely otherwise been shaped by teaching in a Great Books program in Nova Scotia. That is to say, the mental furniture, the fragments, things remembered and half remembered. He's a very significant part of that world. Though so too is a lot of dialogue from the Gilmore Girls. So that's just to say, it's a mess up there, and you should always remember, Dante, you will get what you love in the end. So we'll see who wins out, T.S. Eliot or the Gilmore Girls. So we'll just begin.
Okay.
From line 19 of The Wasteland. What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? The Son of Man you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images, where the sun beats and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief and the dry stone no sound of water. Only there is shadow under this red rock. Come in under the shadow of this red rock, and I will show you something different from either your shadow at morning striding behind you, or your shadow at evening rising to meet you. I will show you fear in a handful of dust.
Okay.
So the primary text for our time together this morning, though I know 3 readings were assigned, is arguably the single most significant English language poem of the 20th century, T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland.
Okay.
Something of the poem's promise was in the air even before its publication in 1922, in a bid, for example, to shore up its reputation as the most progressive of progressive literary establishments. America's foremost journal of experimental poetry, The Dial, offered T.S. Eliot roughly the equivalent of $60,000 for the poem, sight unseen. Likewise, Ezra Pound, the most notorious of modernist poets, who served as midwife to Eliot's text, suggested that the poem was so remarkable that every other poet of the early 20th century ought to close up shop. But despite this anticipation, so there's widespread anticipation, the poem's early reception offered little suggestion or indication of its eventual success. Media responses were, to say the least, mixed. One reviewer of the poem, for example, suggested that the wasteland was little more than waste paper. If any of you felt that way, please don't tell me if you felt that way. Another slightly more sympathetic critic recognized that a poem might be difficult, referring to the difficulty of the poem, might be difficult if it were communicating hard truths, but went on to say that Eliot's poem sadly offered no truth at all.
Oh my God, that's
And still another said that he
crazy.
could see Eliot sneering at the world behind the tapestry of difficult illusions that make up the texture of the poem.
That's fucking crazy. I did not know that. It was
And yet, relatively
received like
quickly,
that.
despite these early receptions, The Wasteland was also received as the archetypal and authoritative expression of an entire generation's disaffection.
Mm-hmm.
For example, an early reviewer notes that The Wasteland, and here I quote from Burton Roscoe, gives voice to the universal despair or resignation arising from the spiritual and economic consequences of World War I, the cross purposes of modern civilization, the cul-de-sac into which both science and philosophy seem to have gotten themselves, and the breakdown, this might be interesting to think about with respect to your theme this year, of the whole, the breakdown of all great purposes which give joy and zest to the business of living. Later, the poet Kathleen Raine, whom some of you may know, observed that Eliot was the poet who took upon himself the burden of experiencing the world for his generation.
Okay.
It is not every poet who has found himself compelled to be the prophet of truths so terrible. Though Eliot claimed, I think somewhat disingenuously, that the work was simply an effort to relieve his personal grouse against life, the poem's authoritative status was secured within a decade of its appearance. Indeed, its canonization as the quintessential modernist literary work has resulted in its widespread anthologizing and its near continuous reading for just over 100 years. And so this week, for those of you who've not encountered the poem before, this week will enter into the ranks of that great reading public. So my plan for this morning's lecture is actually quite simple. In the first half, I'd like to briefly explore Eliot's life and the modernist context of this poem's creation, both in the immediate aftermath of the Great War, the First World War, and at a time of severe psychological distress for Eliot.
Okay.
So that's to say that the poem might be said to emerge at the intersection, or from the intersection, of both a cultural and a personal crisis. You may, in anticipation of Wednesday's lecture, want to think about the parallel between Eliot's context, personal and cultural crisis, and Dante's context, that is to say, crisis of empire and personal crisis of exile. There's a kind of, I think for Eliot, there's a kind of crucial point of comparison there. But secondly, having thought about the context of the poem and its emergence, the second half of the lecture will offer a close reading. I'd like to walk through The Wasteland and highlight some key passages of what I've called here Eliot's Sibylline oracles. The reason for that will become clear when we look at the epigraph to the poem. I think it will become clear why I've called it his Sibylline oracles, though you may already be thinking of Virgil's Aeneid. At the heart of this lecture is a very simple argument, namely that the early works of Eliot that you've been asked to read for this week, Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, Tradition and Individual Talent, and then of course this poem, The Wasteland, which is the latest of Eliot's works we're considering from 1922, that these works, all of them pose a question. The question, I think, can be articulated in any number of ways, but Eliot does so for us in a play from 1939, in which he has a character ask, where does one go in an age of insanity? So that, I think, is the sort of description in a nutshell of the early 20th century for Eliot. And the response in the play comes, one goes somewhere on the other side of despair. So I want to track this question, where does one go, today? And then in our second lecture this week that will explore Eliot's relationship to Dante more in depth, think about what might lie on the other side of despair, at least in the context of Eliot's work.
Mm-hmm.
So please forgive me if this is more or less formal than you customarily is the case.
Okay.
Yes, but I'm sorry, I'm not sure why I asked you. I don't have another plan. So this is what you get. This is what you get. Okay. Thomas Stearns Eliot was born in St. Louis, Missouri, on September 26th, 1888.
Okay.
To a wealthy and very influential family dedicated to the ideals of moral improvement and public service that animated much of late 19th century American culture. That ideal of progress, I think, is important to have in mind, both of the person and of the nation, was by the time of Eliot's birth a well-established cultural assumption. Things move from worse to better, from less complex to more, from primitive to cultured.
Okay.
This was a well-established cultural assumption with deep roots in the scientific and the literary, commercial, and philosophical life of the late 18th and 19th centuries.
Mm-hmm.
Though born in Missouri, you may know already that Eliot's family was in fact not native to the Midwest. Rather, Eliot belonged to the intellectual and professional elite of America's eastern seaboard, the Boston Brahmins.
Okay.
So naturally enough, he pursued his university studies at Harvard, eventually submitting a doctoral dissertation in philosophy by roughly 1914. He never went on to defend that dissertation, but nonetheless submitted it. For our purposes, I think it's useful to note that Eliot first went to Europe in 1910 as part of a year abroad, visiting London in 1911, returning to Harvard for the years between 1911 and 1915, when he finally settled permanently in England, becoming in the minds of many a British poet, though of course himself well aware and important for us to remember, a fundamentally American thinker and writer.
Yeah, I don't
The
think
list
of
of Eliot's acquaintances in these early years of his doctoral work and as an emerging critic and poet reads as a kind of who's who of modern intellectuals. In Paris, for example, he attended the lectures of Henri Bergson. Many people argue that Bergson's notions of time are present in Eliot's poetry. He was on intimate and very strange terms with the British philosopher and public intellectual Bertrand Russell. He met and was published by Virginia and Leonard Woolf. And most significantly for The Wasteland, he became a close companion of the most infamous poet of the early part of the 20th century, Ezra Pound. So you can see Pound here, and this is just an indication. Pound, of course, the poem is dedicated to Pound. This gives you a sense of the editorial work that Pound was engaged in that reduced the poem from somewhere around 1,500 lines to the roughly slightly less than 500 lines that we have now. The Wasteland was published in 1922. A year that is often called the Year of Miracles. 1922 saw not only the publication of The Wasteland, but also the appearance of James Joyce's Ulysses.
Oh, yes.
Considered the great modernist novel, so it often considered the novel form of The Wasteland, or The Wasteland, the poetic form of that novel. This year also saw the first English translation of Ludwig Wittgenstein's Tractatus, Virginia Woolf's Jacob's Room, both volumes in English for the first time of Spengler's Decline and Fall of the West. You might want to think about that title in relation to Eliot, as well as the appearance in English translation of the first parts of Marcel Proust's Remembrance of Things Past.
Oh my God.
A title worth considering in relation to The Wasteland. There's some others here. That Harlem Shadowed by Claude McKay, of course, also in certain sense inaugurating the Harlem Renaissance.
Yes.
But though published in 1922, the poem was largely composed in 1921, during a time of immense personal distress for Eliot. Towards the end of that year, Eliot received a 3-month leave from his work in the Colonial and Foreign Department of Lloyd's Bank in England, in the wake of a nervous breakdown precipitated in part by the chronic tensions that animated Eliot's marriage. If you've not had, or if you had not had a personal breakdown in the early 20th century, it was almost a sure indication that you would have little literary success. As he writes in our poem, my nerves are bad tonight. Yes, bad. Stay with me. Eliot observed later in his life that his wife Vivian, in their marriage, found little more than disappointment rather than happiness. What Eliot found, he said, I can't even say it without laughing. Eliot found in their marriage the state of mind required to write The Wasteland. Eliot's complaints of worn nerves, he self-diagnosed himself as having neurasthenia. It's a term coined in 1869 by an American doctor. Eliot's complaints of neurasthenia captured more, I think, than the anguish of his unhappy marriage. Rather, Eliot's Europe, his new home, was awash in the psychologically fractured, the anxious, and the displaced. And this was prior to the First World War.
Yeah.
So August Strindberg, for example, asks in 1894, what is happening to me? Are my nerves undergoing an evolution towards oversensitivity? And are my senses becoming much too delicate? Am I becoming a modern man? Pose that to my students most of the time. Viennese cultural critic notes Riley in the same time, 1891, when modernism says man, it actually means nerves. Remarkably, the age of anxiety that attended the transition between 19th and 20th centuries was also accompanied by astounding revolutions in artistic forms, which seemed to breed uncontrollably at the turn of the 20th century. From Neo-Impressionism to Cubism to Dadaism, Surrealism, and Futurism, there was an explosion of artistic schools and manifestos united by little more than a shared conviction that received forms of art, literature, and philosophy could no longer speak to the modern person.
Yeah, right.
One must instead, as Ezra Pound insisted, make it new. These new schools of art that proliferated around the turn of the 20th century, both prior to and after the First World War, they seem to move in two directions. There was, on the one hand, a kind of heightened frivolity or even enervation among the futurists and the Dadaists, who professed at times an almost pathological glee in the destruction and absurdity of 20th century culture. The First World War itself was initially seen by the godfather of the futurists, though not by him alone, also by folks not connected to the movement, as a great movement of cultural purification. If you've seen Taxi Driver, you might note that Robert De Niro's character has a similar kind of relationship. His desire that a great rain would come and wash the gutters clean.
Okay.
The title of Marinetti's 1915 book of poems, I think, captures the futurist orientation, called War, the Only Hygiene of the World. Dadaism offered a slightly less dark, but nonetheless relentless assault on rationality and causal connections. Hugo Ball captures the spirit wonderfully. In 1916, he writes in his manifesto of Dadaism, how does one achieve eternal bliss? By saying Dada. How does one become famous? By saying Dada. With a noble gesture and delicate propriety, till one goes crazy, till one loses consciousness. How can one get rid of everything that smacks of journalism, worms,